In the mist-shrouded village of Blackmoor, whispers of a phantom carriage that rides at night stir fear in the hearts of the townsfolk. Renowned investigator James Harroway, drawn by the eerie tales and unexplained disappearances, arrives to unravel the mystery. As he delves deeper into the shadowy legends, James finds himself enchanted by a captivating young woman whose haunting beauty conceals a chilling secret. Little does he know, his infatuation is but a sinister ploy, luring him closer to a fate more ghastly than he could ever imagine, becoming the next victim of the ghostly carriage. The flickering light of the hearth cast long shadows across the modest drawing room of the Houndstooth Inn. Seated comfortably in a well-worn armchair, James Harroway, a young journalist with a reputation for debunking supernatural myths, sipped his scotch thoughtfully. Across from him, his old friend and local historian, Thomas Whitaker, leaned forward with a look of anticipation. "You really believe you can debunk the legend of the Phantom Carriage, James?" Thomas asked, his eyes reflecting a mix of skepticism and amusement. James set down his glass, his face breaking into a confident smile. "Tom, you know I've made a career out of exposing these so-called supernatural occurrences. Remember the haunted lighthouse of Dover, a mere trick of light and sound, and the poltergeist of Penhurst, nothing but old pipes and a drafty house. This phantom carriage will be no different." Thomas chuckled. "But this is different, James. Blackmoor isn't like those other places. This legend has roots deep in the heart of the village. It's more than just a story here. It's part of our history." The more entrenched the myth, the more satisfying the debunking, James replied with a wink. "Think of it, Tom. Every year, on the anniversary of this unsolved murder, the townsfolk are paralyzed by fear. It's the 20th century, for heaven's sake. We should be beyond these ghost stories." Thomas leaned back, studying his friend. "But what if there's some truth to it? This town has never been the same since that night. People are genuinely afraid, James. They say the headless coachman seeks revenge for the unjust death of the murder victim." James scoffed. "Superstition and fear, that's all it is. People love a good ghost story, especially one that can't be explained. It's the perfect opportunity for me to show that it's all smoke and mirrors. I'll stay in Blackmoor, investigate the scene, talk to the locals, and by the time I leave, the Phantom Carriage of Blackmoor will be nothing more than an interesting footnote in the local history books." Thomas sighed, knowing there was no change in his friend's mind. "Well, just be careful, James. Blackmoor can be unwelcoming to outsiders, especially those who meddle in its past." James stood up, finishing his drink. "I appreciate the concern, Tom, but I've faced worse than a few unfriendly villagers. By the time I'm done, I'll have uncovered the logical explanation behind this phantom carriage, and Blackmoor can finally move on from this absurd legend." With a determined glint in his eye, James Harroway prepared to delve into the mystery of the phantom carriage, unaware that he was about to encounter something that would challenge his deepest convictions about the natural and supernatural world. The morning sun cast a pale light over the quaint, cobblestone streets of Blackmoor as James Harroway made his way to the local library. The air was crisp, and a thin mist clung to the ground, giving the village an eerie, almost timeless quality. He pushed open the heavy oak door of the library, the scent of old books and polished wood greeting him. Inside, he found himself in the company of dusty tomes and ancient manuscripts. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, watched him curiously as he approached the desk. "I'm researching the history of Blackmoor, particularly the legend of the Phantom Carriage and the unsolved murder that's tied to it," James explained. The librarian's expression turned solemn. "The tragedy of poor Eleanor Blythe," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. "Follow me." She led him to a secluded section of the library, where she pulled out several old newspapers and a few handwritten journals. "This should get you started," she said, leaving him alone with the documents. As James delved into the archives, he discovered that the murder occurred on a cold, moonless night in 1898. Eleanor Blythe, a young woman of noble birth, was found dead in the woods near Blackmore, her body lying next to an overturned carriage. The town was shocked, and rumours swirled about the circumstances of her death. The newspapers reported that Eleanor was to elope that night with a local stable hand, Thomas Warwick, a match her family vehemently opposed, but Thomas was nowhere to be found, and suspicion quickly fell upon him. Despite an extensive manhunt, he was never located, leading many to believe he had murdered Eleanor and fled. However, as James sifted through the journals, he found entries from various townsfolk that suggested a different story. These accounts hinted at a more sinister plot involving Eleanor's family, particularly her father, Lord Blythe, who was known for his ruthless ambition and disdain for anyone beneath his social standing. It was rumoured that Lord Blythe had discovered the elopement plan and, in a fit of rage, arranged for Thomas to be taken care of and staged Eleanor's death as a tragic accident. The mystery deepened as James read about sightings of the Phantom Carriage shortly after Eleanor's death. Witnesses claimed to have seen a spectral carriage driven by a headless coachman roaming the woods on the anniversary of the murder. Some believed it was the spirit of Thomas Warwick, eternally searching for his lost love, Eleanor. The more James read, the more he realised that this was not just a simple ghost story. It was a tale of love, betrayal, and vengeance that had left a deep scar on the town of Blackmore. Determined to uncover the truth, he closed the dusty journal and set out to interview the descendants of those involved, hoping to piece together the events of that fateful night and lay the legend of the Phantom Carriage to rest. James Harroway left the library with a mind swirling with theories and half-formed hypotheses. He decided his next step was to visit the actual scene of the murder. The woods where Eleanor Blythe's body was discovered were on the outskirts of Blackmore, a place locals avoided, especially as dusk approached. As he made his way through the dense undergrowth, the atmosphere grew heavier, the trees seeming to absorb sound, creating an eerie silence. James, ever the pragmatist, focused on the task at hand, pulling out his notebook and a measuring tape. He began examining the terrain meticulously, noting the width and slope of the old road where the carriage would have travelled. As he immersed himself in his work, a sudden killing sound pierced the silence. A distinct, thunderous clatter, like the approach of a horse-drawn carriage. It seemed to come from right behind him. Whirling around, James found nothing but the still, quiet woods. He frowned, trying to rationalize the sound. It must be the wind through the trees, he muttered to himself, though the wind was barely a whisper. Shaking off the unease, he returned to his investigation, measuring tire tracks and trying to visualize the scene on that fateful night. He sketched the layout, considering the possibility of an accident or a deliberate act. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the big trees, James decided it was time to head back. As he packed his equipment, a soft, almost inaudible whisper floated through the air. "Help me!" He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was faint, ethereal, like a fragment of a dream. He scanned the surrounding area, but there was no one in sight. The rational part of his mind insisted it was just his imagination, fueled by the day's research and the eerie setting. Yet, as he made his way back through the woods, the whisper echoed in his mind, unsettling him. Once back at the Houndstooth Inn, he sat down in his room, spreading out his notes and sketches. He tried to focus on the factual evidence, the measurements, the historical accounts, but the haunting sound of the carriage and the whispered plea refused to be dismissed. That night, as he lay in bed, the events of the day replayed in his mind. The logical, skeptical part of him was at war with the inexplicable experiences he'd had in the woods. Despite his disbelief in the supernatural, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the legend of the Phantom Carriage of Blackmore, something dark and tragic, calling out to be uncovered. The following morning, James awoke feeling refreshed and eager to continue his investigation. He headed downstairs to the dining area of the Hound's Tooth Inn for breakfast, where he was greeted by a young waitress with a warm smile and sparkling eyes. Her presence was like a breath of fresh air in the heavy, historical atmosphere that had enveloped him since his arrival in Blackmore. "Good morning. I'm Elizabeth," she said cheerfully as she poured him a cup of coffee. "What brings you to Blackmore? Not many outsiders visit, especially not this time of year." James introduced himself and briefly explained his purpose in Blackmore. As they chatted, he found himself drawn to her lively spirit and knowledge of the village. On a whim, he invited her to join him for dinner that evening, and to his delight, she accepted. He spent the day back in the library, poring over old maps and police reports, trying to piece together the events surrounding Eleanor Blythe's death. Despite his focus, his thoughts kept drifting to Elizabeth and their upcoming dinner. That evening, over a candle-lit meal at the inn, James found himself enjoying Elizabeth's company far more than he had anticipated. They talked about everything from local folklore to their personal aspirations, creating an unexpected connection. Curious, James asked if she knew anything about the Phantom Carriage. "I've heard the stories, like everyone in Blackmore," Elizabeth replied, her eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. "It's just local legend to me, tales to scare children, but after hearing you talk about it, I must admit, it's quite fascinating." As dinner came to an end, Elizabeth, caught up in the mystery and excitement, suggested a spontaneous walk to the site of the murder. "I've never actually been there at night," she said, a hint of adventure in her voice. "I'd love to see it for myself, especially with someone who knows so much about the legend." James was surprised but intrigued by the proposal. The idea of visiting the site at night was unnerving, yet the prospect of experiencing it with Elizabeth was too compelling to resist. They set off under the starry night sky, the path to the woods illuminated by the pale light of the moon. As they walked, the village's lights faded behind them, leaving them surrounded by the sounds of the nocturnal forest. The atmosphere at the murder site was eerily calm, with only the gentle rustling of leaves breaking the silence. As they stood there, James shared his findings and theories, noticing how Elizabeth listened intently, her fascination evident. The night air was cool, and a sense of unease hung over them as they contemplated the tragic events that had taken place on this very spot over a century ago. Unbeknownst to them, their visit to the site would unearth more than just old legends and would propel them further into the heart of the mystery surrounding the Phantom Carriage of Blackmore. In the stillness of the wooded clearing, James and Elizabeth walked slowly, the crunch of leaves underfoot breaking the silence. James pointed out where Eleanor Blythe's body was found, describing the layout based on his meticulous research. Elizabeth listened, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. Suddenly, the distinct sound of hooves and wheels thundering against the ground shattered the calm. The noise was so intense, so immediate, that both instinctively jumped off the path, expecting a real carriage to barrel through. They turned, hearts racing, but saw nothing. The woods were as still and silent as before, as if the sound had never been. "Was that it? The carriage?" Elizabeth asked, her voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. James, struggling to maintain his composure, tried to rationalize what they had just heard. His eyes scanned the road, searching for a logical explanation. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A black carriage, stationary, with a restless horse pawing the ground, as if eager to bolt. "Look there," he whispered to Elizabeth, pointing towards the spectral carriage. As they watched, the carriage suddenly lurched into motion, racing towards them at an otherworldly speed. The sight was so surreal, so contrary to everything James believed, that for a moment he was frozen in shock. "Look out!" he yelled, pulling Elizabeth out of the carriage's path. They dove into the underbrush just as the Phantom Carriage swooped past. The ground where they had stood moments before now empty. As the carriage passed, James looked up and caught a glimpse of a figure in the back window. A young man, his face contorted in a silent scream. The image was burned into his mind, a haunting visage that seemed to be etched with pain and desperation. They lay there for a moment, panting, trying to process what had just happened. Elizabeth clutched James's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Did you see it too? The man in the carriage?" James nodded, his skepticism crumbling under the weight of the undeniable reality they had just experienced. "Yes, I saw him. It was like he was trapped, somehow." They slowly stood up, their eyes fixed on the spot where the carriage had disappeared. The forest was once again silent, the apparition gone as quickly as it had appeared. "What does this mean?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. "Is the legend true?" James was at a loss for words. All his beliefs, his convictions about the rational and explainable nature of the world, were being challenged. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm going to find out. We need to understand who that man was and why he's trapped in this phantom carriage." As they made their way back to the village, a new determination took hold of James. The mystery of the Phantom Carriage of Blackmoor was more than just a legend. It was a puzzle that he was now compelled to solve, not just to debunk a myth, but to uncover a hidden truth that had been lost to time. James awoke the next morning, the early rays of sunlight filtering through the curtains. He turned to find Elizabeth's side of the bed empty, her presence from the night before now just a lingering warmth. A sense of unease gripped him as he quickly dressed and made his way downstairs, hoping to find her there. In the inn's dining room, he asked the staff if they had seen Elizabeth, but no one had. His concern deepened. The memory of the previous night's encounter with the Phantom Carriage loomed large in his mind. He couldn't shake the fear that she might have returned to the site of the murder. As he was about to leave the inn, a middle-aged man approached him. "Hello, I'm Arthur. I too am investigating the legend of the carriage and have some fascinating information I need to share with you," he said eagerly. James, torn between the urgency to find Elizabeth and his thirst for answers, reluctantly decided to hear Arthur out. They sat at a secluded table, and Arthur began to unfold his findings. "I believe Eleanor was killed by her father, who also murdered Thomas Warwick, and then blamed the murder on him," Arthur explained. "But here's the thing. The Phantom Carriage was a legend even before Eleanor's murder. It just became associated with her." Arthur leaned in, his eyes intense. "The Phantom Carriage requires a willing sacrifice, someone who goes to the site with love in their heart. It's an old part of the legend, long forgotten." James scoffed at the notion. No one would willingly go to a murder site to sacrifice themselves for love. It's preposterous. As they talked, time slipped away unnoticed. It was only when James glanced out the window and saw the darkness outside that he realized they had been talking for hours. A sense of urgency gripped him. "I need to go," he said abruptly, standing up. Arthur looked up at him with a knowing gaze. "I understand," he said, a hint of solemnity in his voice. James hurried out of the inn, his mind racing. The story Arthur had told seemed far-fetched, yet after what he had witnessed the night before, he couldn't dismiss it outright. As he made his way towards the woods, his worry for Elizabeth grew. The idea that she might have gone to the site of the murder, possibly drawn by the legend of the carriage, filled him with dread. The woods were dark and foreboding as he entered, the moon casting eerie shadows between the trees. He called out for Elizabeth, his voice echoing through the silence. The legend of the Phantom Carriage, once just a curious mystery to solve, had now become a personal and urgent quest. James knew he had to find Elizabeth before it was too late, and confront whatever truth lay waiting in the heart of the Blackmoor woods. As James hurried him through the darkened woods to the site of the murder, his heart pounded with a mix of fear and desperation. When he arrived, what he saw was beyond his wildest imaginings. There, in a clearing bathed in moonlight, stood the Phantom Carriage, its form ethereal and ghostly. Beside it was Elizabeth, her expression one of sorrow and resolve, and gathered around were several villagers, their faces grim and determined. Confusion etched on his face, James approached the scene. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Elizabeth rushed towards him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and guilt. "You came, thank you," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. Before he could react, several villagers seized him. James struggled, but their grips were firm and unyielding. "If you had not come, it would have been me," Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He has come willingly?" one of the villagers asked. "Yes," Elizabeth replied, her voice laced with sorrow. "With love in his heart." The man pressed further. "Yes, for me," she responded, her eyes not leaving James's. "And it is dusk," the man concluded with a note of finality. The villagers began to pull James towards the open door of the carriage. Inside, an ancient, half-skeletal figure waited, its presence chilling and commanding. As it reached out and grasped James, he felt an overwhelming force, his willpower draining away as he was pulled into the carriage. The door shut with a definitive thud, and the carriage sped off, disappearing into the distance. In the back window, James's face was visible, his hands banging against the glass, his mouth open in a silent scream. "Well done, my dear," a man said to Elizabeth, his voice a mixture of relief and gratitude. "We are again safe for the next cycle, because of you." Elizabeth's face was a mask of anguish, her eyes reflecting the weight of her actions. "Had we not made the sacrifice, as our fathers and forefathers did, the ghost of the carriage would have destroyed our village. But now, it's time to celebrate," the man continued, a sense of relief permeating his words. The villagers began to disperse, leaving Elizabeth alone in the clearing. The weight of her choice, the sacrifice she had made for the safety of her village, hung heavily in the air. As the moon shone down on the now empty site, the legend of the Phantom Carriage of Blackmoor had claimed another soul, and the cycle would continue, shrouded in secrecy and tragedy.
And if you're still looking to fulfill your thirst for more horror, don't forget to check out this next video, unless of course you're frozen with fear already.